Hello and welcome to What Comes to Mind, Season 2 of The Psychonaut Show. This is John K. Burton, MD, psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and your host on this podcast that brings ideas from the history of psychoanalysis to solve problems in everyday life. In this episode, we're going to explore models of the mind. Now, Julio, the sound designer here on the Psychonaut Show, who also keeps track of our engagement stats, assures me that there is somebody or some buddies who spend some time listening in. So you all know, and thanks a lot, by the way, for listening, that I like to pick topics from the history of psychoanalysis with names that seem mysterious and magical. Well, this episode's title really isn't one of those. And the models that we're talking about are not like Lauren Hutton, Cindy Crawford, or Naomi Campbell. And was that a dad joke? You know, it used to be that dad jokes were just called bad jokes, and I think that that was kind of a bad joke, but I had to say something about models. But I am pretty proud of myself for hitting the 70s, Lauren Hutton, 80s, Cindy Crawford, 90s, Naomi Campbell, supermodels. But you know what? I can't go further than that. I'm a fan of Absolutely Fabulous, which centers around fashion and modeling. And Jennifer Saunders finally came out like 25 years after the show started with a movie that everyone was wanting her to come out with. And it's not the greatest movie in the world, but if you're a fan of the show, it's fantastic. I own it. I've seen it 3 or 4 times already.
Sweetheart, darling.
Your grandmother's home.
Darling!
But I tell you, I didn't know who the models in the movie were.
We love you.
We thought we'd go to Goa for an Ayurvedic colonic.
It's totally so beautiful.
And the whole plot centers around Kate Moss being a historical figure.
How bad can this be? I mean,
You have probably killed Kate Moss.
That makes you feel the time passing. And I can't believe RuPaul, who's super famous now, came out with her song Supermodel like 25 years ago. That's as long ago as the Beatles were at the time that Supermodel came out in the 90s. But anyway, we're going back to the 1890s, not the 1990s. And even though this topic doesn't sound magical, it really is fundamental to everything that we talk about on the Psychonaut Show. So I decided that we were halfway through season 2, and we had better bring these models down the catwalk.
Yeah, on the catwalk.
Another dad joke again. So Freud's models are the topographical model and the structural model of the mind. We'll go into these more, but so you have an image in your mind, a beautiful model, let me picture them for you. The topographical model is called that because it sees the mind consisting of the system conscious and the system unconscious, separated by a repression barrier. So it is sort of a model of 2 different lands. Topography, that's why it's called the topographical model. And the residents of one of the lands, the system unconscious, keep trying to invade the other, the system conscious, but they're held back by the repression barrier. So actually this is sort of starting to sound a little like magic and fantasy. It's like the maps at the beginning of the novels, like how is Middle Earth laid out in Lord of the Rings. And then on the other hand, the structural model are those 3 agencies of the mind that you've probably heard about somewhere. It's all over our language these days: the id, the ego, and the superego. And they are like 3 heirs to the throne, like Daenerys Targaryen, Cersei Lannister, and Jon Snow, in keeping with the fantasy metaphor here in Game of Thrones coming up in April. And aren't the producers of Game of Thrones sort of torturing us by making us wait so long for the final season? But anyway, the point being with the metaphor is sometimes these 3 agencies work together, and sometimes they fight against each other, sometimes 2 gang up on one, etc. But each one has a different agenda and a different way of running the mind. Both models are useful in helping us sort out things that come up in our lives. They're useful just in different situations. So I'm going to give you some examples of people that were helped by thinking about these different models. Now, the first person was a patient who came to treatment with me, and he was very much looking forward to understanding his unconscious. He just knew that there were things in his mind that he wasn't aware of, getting in the way of making a good career decision and getting into a relationship, and he knew that figuring them out would help him move forward. But psychodynamic work is hard and it takes time. Things come up and another thing comes up. And the analyst, me in this case, tries to see the patterns and point out the connections. But when I would do that, this person would just say to me, so what am I supposed to do with that? For example, I might say, every time you think of some way you are like your mother, you stop what you are doing and you can't keep at the thing that you're trying to do. And we know that you have an image of your mother as your ideal, so maybe you can't let yourself into what you see as her territory. And it's not really important whether my connection, what I was making of that, the interpretation, was correct or not. What's important is how he responded. He would say, yeah,
that feels right. But what am I supposed to do about it?
He really wouldn't think about it any further and kept saying to me,
and so what am I supposed to do?
After a while of this happening, we realized that he had an idea that his unconscious would just be revealed through the process of therapy in full form, like the heavens opening. And then he would just understand himself totally and he would be free. And that kept not happening. And eventually he began to feel hopeless and bored with therapy. If he couldn't really see his unconscious, what was the point? And that also made him feel really bored with himself, which was basically his problem that he wanted to solve. And he was hopeless that he would ever get better. A little bit later, I'm going to tell you how thinking about the topographical model really helped him get over this hump in his work on himself. So now let me give you another example of someone who found that thinking about the structural model was helpful. A woman was feeling controlled by her drive to go out and pick up attractive men. Models, in fact. In keeping with our theme, because this is New York and there are, in fact, a lot of models, both male and female, around. Now, she enjoyed this very much and was not feeling shame about her sexual desire or her sexual life, but just felt that it was something that was out of her control. It was something she felt she always needed to do. And she thought that she might like at least the option of staying home, watching Netflix, or going out to dinner with the female friend, or even to go out and talk with one of these hot guys without needing to go home with him. Again, she didn't have a lot of judgment about her sexual desire. She had passed through testament number 1, the first testament of the Psychonaut, which is neutrality. She was just feeling that there was a part of herself that took over, and she wanted to feel less compulsive. So she got to a point of feeling really mindful of this drive, this preoccupation when she would go out, and she decided one night that she was going to exercise other options, just talking and going home on her own. But it turns out that a really beautiful man showed up at this place where she was, and she really wanted to go home with him. She was not judging herself. If she ended up giving in to her usual pattern, that would be okay. She wasn't sure what she wanted to do. She was just looking at other possibilities. But then what she told me happened was the guy
went home before anything happened anyway, and so did I. And I really don't know what to make of that. The decision was sort of chosen for me.
She didn't know what was the right answer since she didn't get to choose and decide herself. And she felt that she was still left with this conflict. Now, before we see how thinking about Freud's models of the mind helped these people get clarity with their problems, let's talk about the theory behind this concept a bit more. So, the topographical model was the first and came from Freud's theory of repression. And remember, Repression and Return of the Repressed was our first real episode in the first season. So now we're going to take a wide angle on our model of repression. And I'm sorry I can't stop with the bad jokes about models, but that's what this episode is about. This is where he first came up with the idea of the system conscious, the system unconscious, and the repression barrier, like a landscape. Again, why it's called the topographical model. Now, there is also sometimes the system pre-conscious. And I hate to make this comparison, but it is sort of like the immigrants in Mexico waiting to get across the border. The system conscious is aware of them, but it doesn't pay attention yet. The repression barrier, and the more I think about this, it is like a metaphor for Trump's wall, or maybe Trump's wall is a metaphor for the repression barrier.
Will begin immediate construction of a border wall.
And actually, as I think about it, the repression barrier sounds kind of fantasy sci-fi, so that's cool in keeping with the aesthetic of the Psychonaut Show. Anyway, back to the topographical model, the repression barrier is just something that keeps out unacceptable mental content. Ideas, feelings, fantasies, etc. It keeps them out of consciousness. Like, I want to scream at the policeman who stopped me when I wasn't really speeding. I better not do that. It's unacceptable. I better not do that, especially if I am a black man. And we'll just leave that as it is. Another really good example of the topographical model is from TV, Mad Men. And in the last scene of episode 9 in the first season, Betty Draper has clearly had it with her suburban housewife existence, had it with her husband, had it with her shrink who never tells her anything, and who talks to her husband behind her back, which is crazy, but apparently that happened. And she's had it with herself. And all that anger and hatred comes to a boiling point. And in the last scene, we see her, cigarette hanging out of her mouth, shotgun pointed at the sky, and she is shooting down each and every one of their neighbors' beloved pet carrier pigeon. Now, that was an unacceptable feeling, and it just boiled over and knocked down the repression barrier. That's the return of the repressed. We can see system conscious, system unconscious, repression barrier, it's all there. So let's go back to the man who was really frustrated with not being able to know his unconscious directly. We needed to talk about what Freud's idea realistically implied. The unconscious, the system unconscious, as much as the topographical model makes it seem like this real place, it's not a real thing. As I have said before, Freud was of that Victorian era, along with Newton and other people and thinkers of that time, and they felt that the world could be understood absolutely. It was just a machine that could be dismantled if they were just smart enough or just persisted enough, and they could understand everything. And Freud really thought he could get to the system unconscious and see it, like my patient wanted. But really, in the 20th century and the 21st century, with things like quantum physics and postmodern thought, we just can't be that certain anymore. In physics, the quantum realm can't be seen, even with the strongest microscope, because it doesn't actually exist as we know existence to be. But it doesn't matter because it has an effect through its influence. A few years ago, physicists proved the existence of the elusive Higgs boson particle, otherwise known as the God particle, but they didn't see it directly. They were smashing things in the Hadron Accelerator, and they proved its existence by proving how it influences things the way the God particle would influence things that could be seen or measured. So the unconscious is like that. We can never see it directly, although the more we know and the more we pay attention to these indirect influences, the more we understand. Now, maybe it's less satisfying than just seeing there it is like a religious vision. There's my neurosis, or there's my fear, or there's my unconscious. But understanding how it works indirectly and always investigating further through these indirect influences is what gets us further. So when this man understood this, it made him a little bit down, but what it allowed him to do was participate in this work of self-understanding as a co-investigator with me and work on putting these patterns together and gradually seeing what was going on. But back to Freud and how he came up with the structural model after the topographical model. He realized that the topographical model only fit some situations. It turns out that there are actually police in the system unconscious too, or what we call defense mechanisms. And we'll do an episode exploring all the species and styles and life cycles and mating calls of the endless inventory of defense mechanisms one of these days. And by the way, that was Anna Freud's, Sigmund's daughter, who we've talked about before. That was a major contribution of her, sort of categorizing the defense mechanisms. But overall, the defense mechanisms are just causing us to hold things out of consciousness. And initially, Freud just thought there was one, repression, which he thought we sort of do semi-consciously. But then he realized that we repress things and we're not even aware that we're doing it. So he had to come up with a different way of explaining this, and that's the structural model. The structures are the id, ego, and superego. Each one has a different function, but each also has an unconscious and conscious portion. As we develop, as our minds develop, the id is the first, and it's the source of all our drives and impulses. And then comes the ego, which is the agency that manages the drives and impulses coming from the id. Freud actually said the ego emerges out of the interaction between the id and reality. And that's sort of quantum physics, actually, if you think about it. It exists only because of a relationship. And then later in life comes the superego through identification with the parents and the resolution of the Oedipus complex, which again, we did already an episode on the Oedipus complex in Season 1. So that is why this episode on the models of the mind is so important, because so many things come out of it. The models of the mind are the basis for understanding so many of these psychoanalytic concepts. But back to the superego. The superego is literally, in German, as Freud put it, das Über-Ich, which means the over-I. It's the part that watches us and holds our values and ideas and lets us know when we are good or bad or right or wrong. So there's the topographical model and there's the structural model. And when you think about these beautiful models of the mind, it is important to remember Freud didn't throw out the topographical model and replace it with the structural model. They're both useful and they both complement each other depending on the situation. So let's go back to the woman in the bar trying to figure out what was the ideal solution for her conflict between her libido, her drive and pleasure, her id to meet and have sex as soon as possible, with her wish to be more measured and in control. She was left with the decision, as she described to me, that it was made for her. The guy left the bar before she knew what she wanted to do. So she didn't know how that she was going to resolve her conflict, and that left her kind of feeling confused. So Freud actually had an image of the relationship between the ego and the id that really helped this woman think about her goals. The metaphor that Freud had was of a horse and rider, the horse being the id and the rider being the ego. And ideally, they ride together as one, connected in intimate, efficient communication and with the same goal. The horse brings the power and the rider brings the direction. But if we really play around with this metaphor, we see that you have to get to that point. And as anyone who has actually been around horses knows, it takes patience and getting to know one another. The horse may start out wild and just wanting to oppose the rider. if the rider is bent on breaking in the horse and gets rough, it just makes things worse. That's more repression. And the rider might be young and inexperienced, not really knowing what to do with the horse. He's gonna get thrown in the course of things, and that's just part of the process. So this metaphor, thinking about it not just as an ideal, but as a relationship and the way that you manage things, really helped this woman think about her conflict and her goals. We don't want to get rid of the wildness and power of the id, that horse. We want to bring it into communication and harmony so that the horse and the rider can be one entity galloping through life with direction and power. This idea really helped her realize that her goal was not to decide which was right, the ego or the id, horse or rider, but that they come in harmony and that each situation is going to have a different outcome. Now, I want to go to the esoteric a little bit, as you know I like to do, especially with my idol Alejandro Jodorowsky and his ideas about the tarot and how they reflect psychology and give us ideas about how to resolve our conflicts and questions. And there's a tarot card known as Key 11 of the Major Arcana. Now we're really getting into fantasy, and it's called Strength. And it is represented by a woman holding the mouth of a lion open. It represents this idea of Freud's of the horse and rider almost exactly. The meaning of strength is that it is the human who is in relationship and in charge, taming the beastly animal nature of the lion, that we have come to a place of managing our animal selves, and that's what the card represents. But a modern representation that I like even better is from the Steampunk Tarot, designed by Barbara Moore and the graphic artist Ali Fell. And even though Alejandro Jodorowsky says the Marseille Tarot is the oldest and it's the only one you should look at, and all the others are just, this is according to him, they reveal the author's own neurosis, I still like this image in the Steampunk Tarot. And in that, they make the woman not holding the lion's mouth open, but pulling a thorn out of its paw. And the idea is that the human woman is showing her control over the beast through kindness rather than force, through understanding what its needs are. And I just happen to think that that is an even better metaphor for what is this relationship between the ego and the id. Since I brought in Jodorowsky, the surrealist, I might as well bring in the mystics. If you're familiar with Buddhism, or even Eckhart Tolle, the guy who thinks he invented Buddhism, I heard someone describe him, you'll think that ego is something that we need to get rid of. Now, firstly, the definitions are a little different. Ego in Buddhism is an illusion that I am a self that's consistent over time and it can be given a value, but ego is an illusion. In psychoanalysis, ego is a set of functions. It's a metaphor and it's an illusion in that way, but they're not the same thing. Still, it leads us to the conundrum that if to be enlightened, we must give up our ego, and all branches of mysticism get to this in one way or another. What do we do with it? Well, it turns out there are some thinkers who are both psychoanalysts and Buddhists, and they've wrestled with this question. In the book Buddhism and Psychoanalysis, edited by Jeremy Safran, one writer says that to achieve the enlightened state of no self, you have to first start with a stable self. In other words, the ego has to be healthy first to go to the next level. And we talked about this last season in the episode The Other Psychonaut, all about psychedelics and people being interested in that. And again, we can see how this topic, the models of the mind, is so important and fundamental for all of these other topics and concepts that we talk about on the Psychonaut Show. I heard on another podcast, Stuff You Should Know, I love those guys, their episode on ayahuasca, that there is even some evidence to suggest that there is a neural equivalent of what we call the ego that gets shut off when the brain is under the influence of psychedelics. And that leads to the ability to see connections that are otherwise filtered out by that neural network or the ego. Now, this topic of psychedelics and the ego is very big these days, as we talked about in that other episode. And the author and journalist Michael Pollan has a book out called How to Change Your Mind, which is an in-depth exploration of the topic of psychedelics. And he has an interesting thesis in the book that the last time that psychedelics preoccupied culture in the 1960s, it was a phenomenon of youth. But he says that it really should be something for people in middle age, because people in middle age have established their sense of ego already, unlike young people who are still working on it, and the people in middle age need to let it go. And again, you can see how this idea of models of the mind and the ego fits with another episode, The 8 Stages of Man, that we did a couple of episodes ago, and you can see it through this lens. Again, the models of the mind is the foundation for so much of what we talk about here. I like to talk about the actual lives of the people who came up with the ideas that we explore here on the Psychonaut Show, the people who first discovered these new lands of our minds. But we actually haven't talked about Sigmund Freud's life yet, and he was the first. Again, I think, like this episode's topic itself, it seems really overdue. And it got me to think, why haven't I brought in his life? After all, he's a person too, with a specific story, just like all the others that we talk about. And then I realized that actually we do often think of Sigmund Freud as somehow beyond having a life of his own. I think we see him as a figure who made some statements about the human mind that we either agree with or we really disagree with. And earlier I said he was like the original vampire in the Anne Rice novels, Akasha. But it occurs to me that he's also like another original and another famous Jewish intellectual whose ideas changed the world, Jesus. He was a man who had a life that can often be overshadowed by a legacy. So talking about what they have in common, the historical Jesus, as far as we know, was born in the backwater of an empire. We forget that because Christianity is such a powerful force in the world, Nazareth was to the Roman Empire sort of like today Guam might be to the American Empire, no offense to Guam. And Freud, too, in the 1800s, was born in a backwater town of an empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The town he was born in was part of Moravia, which is now part of Czechoslovakia. So, really, the boondocks. And like Mary with Jesus, Freud's mother was very important in Freud's development. His mother's name was Amalia, and she was much younger than her husband and very adoring of her son. She called him her golden Siggy. His father, on the other hand, was a wool merchant, so obviously a very different background than the intellectual world that his son would enter and become a leader of. Sort of like how I think about Joseph being a carpenter and playing more of a side role in the stories about Jesus. And Freud later said that boys who know they're their mother's favorites often have a sense of their own specialness that allows them to achieve things in the world. Now, when we hear the word Freudian, we a lot of times have a really specific image in mind that is sort of one-dimensional. And I think in some ways that's similar to the word Christianity. But in fact, the theme of unresolved conflict is a better description of what Freud's life and ideas were all about. Just as if we look beyond the evangelical idealizations and the megachurches, the story of Jesus has conflict as well. It makes it more interesting. For Freud, his story is that he was a gifted student from a humble family background, and he went to medical school and he worked in biology doing laboratory work with eels that later contributed to the discovery of the neuron. And he worked with the famous French neurologist Charcot, who was studying what was called hysteria at the time. But Freud was also very taken with philosophy, and he was exposed to previous ideas about the unconscious mind from Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and even Shakespeare. And Freud also has some myths about his life that are distortions, and one of the big ones is that he was a cocaine addict. This was really a myth. I think the reason that we have this myth today is that Freud was interested in cocaine scientifically back in the 1880s when he was still working as a neurologist, because cocaine had been discovered as having anesthetic properties. One of Freud's famous dreams is called The Dream of the Botanical Monograph, and it's about his writing on cocaine, which later kind of got him into trouble in his career. The idea that he was an addict probably comes from his history of having mouth cancer that was very painful and long-term, and he had to have multiple surgeries for it. So probably this idea that he was a cocaine addict is a combination of those things. Again, not quite accurate to what his life was, something that people kind of came to think about him later on. And another thing that Freud had that strikes me as being common with Jesus is that he had apostles. And they met in what was known as the Wednesday meetings, eventually becoming the International Psychoanalytic Association. And again, similar to the early days of Christianity and what happened afterwards, the role of women in the early days of psychoanalysis is very much misunderstood. Women were part of the International Psychoanalytic Association meetings from the beginning. Sabina Spielrein, played by Keira Knightley in the movie A Dangerous Method, was one of the first. That's why they made the movie. Freud was actually supported by an influential baroness who got him appointed at the university where he had been blocked because he was a Jew. Now, later, leaders of the psychoanalytic movement, especially in America, would try to put women back in their place, a lot like institutional Christianity did. But in early Christianity, according to some historians and theologians, it's likely that there were women apostles and ministers, and Mary Magdalene probably was an apostle herself, but later church fathers, starting with St. Paul, undid all of that. And Freud had a conflicted relationship with many of his apostles, except, of course, for his daughter Anna, leading him to feel betrayed. Most famous of these was Carl Jung, who Freud called his crown prince. Jung was the Aryan Christian from the north that would prevent psychoanalysis from becoming the Jewish science. And like St. Peter, he was supposed to be the rock upon which psychoanalysis would be built. But Jung and Freud broke off their connection in 1913 as Jung was developing his own ideas about psychoanalysis and spirituality, and he wouldn't adhere to Freud's ideas about the Oedipus complex. Now, there's another much less famous, though probably more important relationship that Freud had with Wilhelm Fleiss, who was a doctor of otolaryngology. He was an ENT doctor. And in fact, that metaphor of the ego and the id, the horse and rider, comes from an 1898 letter that Freud wrote to his dear friend, Wilhelm, where he was referring to an old joke that goes along the lines of, "Itzig, where are you riding to? Don't ask me, ask the horse." And I'm not really sure why that's a joke, but that's where the metaphor comes from. And they had a very close relationship, and Freud himself interpreted their connection as being based on a combination of homoeroticism and Jewish mysticism, a heady mixture. Fleiss actually operated on Freud several times because of, again, the mouth cancer. And another of Freud's famous dreams, called the Irma dream, is actually about Fleiss and Freud's repressed ideas that Fleiss probably wasn't such a great doctor. Freud was ultimately betrayed by him in 1906, with Fleiss accusing him of stealing his work and refusing to go along with his own theories of sexuality. So Freud had his Judases too. But why am I comparing Jesus and Freud? I'm not trying to make a statement about Freud being divine or even being as influential or anything like that. Freud called religion an illusion, and self-proclaimed Freudians will probably not like this comparison to Jesus at all, and the more fundamentalist Christians will definitely not like the comparison. But first of all, I think it's just cool how the two stories can look similar. Maybe it's like Joseph Campbell's hero's journey kind of thing.
Use the Force, Luke.
But more importantly, I think it is important to look at the human behind the God and understand the story. Every psychoanalytic paper published in a psychoanalytic journal, at least for a while, was implicitly expected to begin with a reference to Freud, a practice that always seemed to me like the idea that the Bible is the literal word of God. It's orthodoxy. It takes things at face value and you can't argue with them. But when we look behind things, when we look at the stories and the conflicts and the confusion in the man, it gives us a more complex, and I think it's a more useful way to approach his ideas and teaching. What we have now in psychoanalysis are people who claim to be his followers, and actually every religion has this. In Buddhism, it's Zen and Theravada, and Islam, it's Shiite and Sunni, and etc. Freud's followers fight with each other over who is legitimate and call others who don't agree with them heretics. Freud has had a huge impact on how we think, but it's so often misunderstood and distorted, and then many people are turned off from what might be helpful. And that reminds me of Jesus' teachings too. But in the end, I'm making these connections because I'm a psychoanalyst, and that's what we do, looking for connections between seemingly disconnected things all the time, trying to look for patterns and understanding. Sometimes there isn't one, but we do it anyway. Okay, so that was a lot about Freud, and I kind of went out on a limb making the comparison with Jesus. So what I want to do now is tell you about another situation where his idea of the models of the mind, specifically the structural model, is very helpful. Now, we talked about the relationship between the id and the ego as a horse and rider. Now I want to talk about the relationship between the ego and the superego. Now, you remember that the superego is what holds the values and ideals and morals for us. The superego and the ego can be in total harmony, and then you don't even notice its existence. There's just a feeling that I'm me and I'm good. But Freud described the relationship as a grade in the ego, a grade like steepness, not letter grades. So the more the ego feels like it's falling short of the standards of the superego, the more of a grade there is. It's a steeper climb. And this, according to Freud, is what depression is. So let me give you an example.
11. Yeah.
A father was helping his daughter with her math homework, and she was in a STEM program. If you don't know what that is, you're not a parent with kids in high school. It's a science, technology, engineering, and math, and there's an effort to get more girls in this. So this program and being part of this program was, on one hand, a source of pride for her, but on the other, it was a lot of pressure as well. So real setup for the superego to come in. And she was struggling in one of the sections of math and got really anxious, and she was panicked and crying and just unable to do her homework. And her father came in and was helping her talk through it and trying to help her calm down. And she was, after talking to him, able to kind of reduce her anxiety and get the work done. But she said to him in the course of this, okay, it's okay.
It's okay if I'm not going to be a doctor or an engineer.
And of course, it is fine if she's not going to be a doctor or an engineer, but the father recognized that this was her submitting to the harsh superego in her, the highly demanding, high steepness that the superego had over her, telling her that she had to be a doctor or engineer and do really well in math or she wasn't good. And what he said to her was, you don't have to decide now whether you become a doctor or an engineer. What he did in that sentence was he changed the grade between her ego and superego. He made them closer together. He made the superego less demanding and lowered the steepness. He saw the steepness of distance between her superego and ego, how harsh it was being, how far over her ego it felt, and seeing that helped him help her feel better about herself and not let her superego block possibilities for herself in the future. Now, the other thing I want to say about the superego, especially that harsh superego, is that it is very sneaky. We can work really hard on ourselves to get over this kind of self-criticism and make progress, but then it comes up in other ways that seem like it's the goal of the ego to just manage life, but it is really more of that criticism from the superego. Now, this example actually comes from my life. In the 70s, my parents got into a form of psychotherapy called transactional analysis, or TA, and I could do a whole podcast and probably a whole season on this experience. The St. Francis Center for Personal Growth got started in a little town up in Vermont by a couple of ex-nuns from California, At least that's what I was able to put together when I was a teenager that no one told anything to. I saw that at one point there was a monk living with them, and that's probably a whole story there. But let me just say that TA was founded by Eric Berne, a psychiatrist, and he was trying to make Freud's structural model more American and friendly. And instead of id, ego, and superego, he had child, adult, and parent. And the idea is that you were supposed to try to communicate with each other from your adult and watch out for the child who was always saying, I want, and watch out for the parent who was always saying, I should. And my parents really studied this a lot. And for a while, our house was full of conversations like, you're speaking to me from your child, and I need you to speak to me from your adult. And they had all kinds of concepts like plastic fuzzies, and that was basically someone being fake with you, and scripts that were the same as neurosis, essentially. Anyway, my parents were trying to do their best, but the same criticism and negativity that they were trying to free themselves would come up in the course of doing TA. They would say, you shouldn't be talking to me from your parent. You should be talking to me from your adult. So you see how the superego gets its head in there. Even as you think you're freeing yourself from it, it really starts to take over. And it's very important to watch for that. So what is the lesson here? Freud's models of the mind have had a lot of influence on how we think about ourselves and how we interact with each other. And of course, there's a lot of controversy too. It's important to remember that they're metaphors. They're not reality. But these metaphors give us a framework, a way of thinking about how our minds work and how we interact with each other. In the topographical model, the unconscious only exists by how we see its influence. We can't really know it. But it still has a big influence, and if we pay attention to the unconscious, we have more capacity to understand ourselves and to act effectively. These models also give us goals to work towards. In the structural model, to try to not repress our id or child, but think of it as a powerful animal that gives us strength, and that the superego can be a guiding light rather than something that just makes us feel bad. And finally, it's important to remember that the two models complement each other. And with everything, the goal here is harmony and integration. This is Dr. JKB signing off. Since we are exploring together, you make the journey all the richer by subscribing to the show on iTunes. And even better, if you also leave a rating, it helps others to find us. If you have a story about how the concept in this episode helped you figure out something in your life, send it in, please. You can also find me on Facebook and Twitter at Psychonaut Show. Show notes are on the website, thepsychonautshow.com. And if you leave me a question, it may well be an inspiration for an upcoming episode. Until our next trip, judge nothing, question everything, and remember, there's always a reason. Bye for now. All the patient stories presented on the Psychonaut Show are created by me to illustrate an idea. Any resemblance to actual people is purely coincidental. The Psychonaut Show was created and produced by yours truly, John Burton. Art and web design by Hunter Creative. Post-production and sound design by Julio Gonzalez of Zimmer Media. Zimmer Media can be found online at zimmer.co. That's Ximer.co.